Greetings, my name is JC,
And I'm Ian.
and this is the Gamer's Gaiden. In this episode, we're going to be talking about violence in video games. It's a bit of a hot topic recently, so we figured we would, give our opinion on it.
Yeah, we're gonna get a little bit heavy this week.
Maybe. But, Ian, what have you been playing this week?
I have still been playing Fire Emblem
Okay,
Three
cool.
Houses on the Switch.
How's that
Uh,
going?
you know what? I'm about 40 hours in now, and I've mostly been grinding a lot of combats to build up my stats in the various things to recruit all of the various members of the different houses. So I mean, it's a little grindy, but I mean, they make the grind kind of as pleasant as possible. I mean, the
Okay.
combat's really fun.
Mm-hmm.
So, doing that over and over again, it's not awful.
Is it kind of taking away from the game, though? Is it kind of getting past the point of too much a little bit, or?
Honestly, for me, not quite.
Okay.
Um, and I've got probably like one more sort of lengthy session of grinding some combat
All right.
to be able to get these last few people.
How many hours have you put into the game so far?
About 40.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's quite a bit.
So I feel, and I'm not quite halfway through,
Oh, okay.
but that's also been a lot of like combat grinding. Like if I would have just kind of gone through and picked up people as I could,
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably get way less people,
Right.
and B, I would have shortened my time drastically.
So one of the reasons why you're doing so much grinding is because you're kind of doing a more or less complete playthrough, so to speak, where it's not
Yeah,
like
kind
a
of.
completionist, like I got all the trophies playthroughs, but it's like you're getting all of the extra characters that you can and things like that.
Pretty much. I mean, I know that there's some people that I can't get because of the house choice that I made,
Right.
but
That makes sense.
ultimately, I know realistically for me, I'm not gonna play through this again.
Oh, okay.
Just like there's so many things out,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to have another um, like 70, 80 hours to put back into this again after going through it now,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna just miss out on a whole bunch of
Right.
other things coming out. And I'm happy with the experience. I'm not bummed out. The story's cool.
Right.
I picked the path that I thought would be the most fun
Mm-hmm.
for me. I think there's probably at least four, if not more, options story wise.
Yeah, there's three main ones and there's a fourth one.
Oh, I think there's five
Okay.
because mine actually splits in two,
Okay, sure, those are subpaths, but I mean, like, there's four main
and then
individual houses that you can do.
I think there's three.
There's three core ones, and you can unlock a fourth.
Fair.
My friend, I think, has already beaten it two pathways.
Okay.
So yeah, he's working on his third.
Yeah. See, I'm ready to. I mean, as much as I like it, I'm totally into the story. I would watch the anime. Um, it's fantastic, but yeah, I know when I finish this, I'll be ready to move on.
Fair enough.
You know, there's still Dragon Quest Builders 2 that I
Mhm.
really want to finish. And I haven't even like I just kind of like scratched the surface of Ultimate Alliance 3.
Right.
I think I played like maybe an hour of it,
Oh, okay.
and I want to be able to finish that guy because I think
Yeah, that game's probably not too long though.
it's not, but I enjoyed the time that I was spending with it, so I'd
Mhm.
like to be able to get more time into it and be able to tell these wonderful people what I think about Ultimate Alliance 3. But
Cool.
anyways, that's me. JC, what have you been playing this week?
Continuing to play League of Legends.
Oh.
So my
Have you hit 30 yet?
No, I haven't. My alt account is level 23, I believe, and
Shame.
yeah, I went through like five levels, so or 5 or 6 levels, but yeah, so just been kind of playing the game more. What's interesting about the experience of going through levels 1 to 30 is at 20, it really started to drastically change in the competence of the players. Because now it's either Smurf. There's sometimes new players, maybe a fifth of the time there's like a player who doesn't really understand what they're doing or who's just green to the game. And most of the characters who I'm seeing who are ranked are either gold or platinum.
Now, do you think that that's possibly a testament to your skill?
It Potentially could be, but I'll be honest, my account's win rate keeps on wavering between 30 and 60%. It could
That's a
be
big
that,
swing.
yeah, I'll win like 5 games in a row, and then I'll lose like 4 games, and then it'll keep on swinging back and forth. I am getting MVP or ace in a lot of the games that I'm playing according to op.gg. And Mobalytics, they tell you like who the ace of the losing team is and the MVP of the winning team is based off of the new league API metrics that they have produced and released
Okay.
through the new stuff that they updated, I think about 6 months ago or so. So yeah, I do keep on getting that like probably more than half the time. So maybe it is, but I'm not 100% confident on whether or not it is. I think whenever the account hits 30 and then seeing what it's putting me against, then it'll be because if it,
I think the most curious thing is to see where you would get placed when
yeah.
you finish your ranked placement games.
Yeah, I
That's
would
what I'm most
hope
curious
it's at
about.
least silver, but we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, and I look forward to
Mhm.
kind of hearing about it.
Yeah, the play is pretty much the same, other than that drastic change. Because whenever I hit 21, that started to happen, and I don't really see any like overly high elo people. Anytime I see a Smurf, it's basically just a gold Smurf or a plat Smurf. I've gotten a
Like you.
couple. Yeah, I've gotten a couple of them to admit it. I'm like, oh, you're like pretty good at this. Like, what elo are you actually? And they won't tell me. I'm like, well, I'm in gold. Like, how about? And then they're like, oh, okay, well, I'm like plat 3. I'm like, okay, cool, thanks. Just curious. um, yeah, so that's what I've been doing over the last week. But let's get into it. So, violence in video games. It's kind of
Right.
a hot topic that's kind of come back over again over the years, really.
Yeah.
And recently has been a huge topic that a lot of the news outlets and even the president has the United States has talked about, and as well as many different news articles and different news sites and just people on YouTube as well. So this
Like
is
us.
yeah, this is our 2 cents on it
Yeah.
as what we have seen, but
4 cents because there's two of us.
and the we decided that we should start off with a little bit of its history and kind of go into that. And was we found interesting was this has been going on for a really long time
I
because
mean, almost as long as video games.
yeah, and I guess one of the first controversies with violence in video games was the game called Death Race, which was released in 1976 in the arcade. And this game is really primitive. It's kind of like Pong and Pac-Man primitive.
Yeah, it's similar to that. Apparently, it was built off the framework of a game released the year previous called Demolition Derby,
Yeah.
which I think you were crashing into each other,
Mm-hmm.
and then
I guess they took that a little bit further, and you run over stick people essentially. Now the lore of this game is that you're running over gremlins, but
yeah, when you look
like
at the
if you look at the graphics, which I'll show here and a couple screenshots, they're stick people.
but
So
if you see the cabinet art too, it's got like a skeleton or like a skull head.
yeah,
All skulls are heads. And then it's something about like killing monsters.
yeah. Apparently they're supposed to be gremlins.
Yeah,
But they're fairly tall and according
they're
to the
humanoid
car, they're
shapes.
humanoid shapes. But
And
this,
they become crosses when you run over them.
yeah, yeah, and this kind of
Everybody,
sparked controversy at the time, where people were concerned about essentially that they looked too much like humans, and it was essentially simulating violence through a video game, essentially, and people took quite a big issue with it,
yeah.
and that was kind of the first foray into the whole violence in video games controversy. So over time, basically, this led into the eventual rating systems that the various countries use across the world, and they essentially assist in categorizing video games into appropriate like age groups and categories on what their content is, on whether it's violent or there's like themes of gambling or suggestive themes in it and things like that, or tobacco
Tobacco
use and things like that. Yeah. In North America, at least, one of the starting points where this sort of began was in 1992, where two U.S. senators, Joe Lieberman from Connecticut and Herb Cole from Wisconsin basically started court hearings about video games and violence and their concerns on how it affected children.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess the one of Lieberman's aides, or something similar, like one of the people that worked for him,
mhm.
um, was talking to him about it. His kid wanted him to buy the home version of Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis,
Yeah.
and like Joe Lieberman was just like appalled that something like this existed,
Yeah.
and he kind of started to dig into it.
Hmm. And these court hearings didn't necessarily only talk about violence in video games. They also did talk about some of the suggestive themes in video games and things like that. Because some of the main games that were cited were Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, which is more suggestive theme
Yeah.
based, and Lethal Enforcers, which is arcade and home console port on the Genesis with a light gun. And there's many other games that they cited, but those are the main games effectively that they went over in a large amount of detail anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, like a night trap and sexual content in video games is a whole other issue. So we'll kind
Mm-hmm.
of not really get into that too much. But I mean, Lethal Enforcers, people were concerned because it was the light gun was like a Magnum.
Yeah.
It was a big revolver,
Mm-hmm.
whereas up until that point, most light guns that you got were very like future looking.
Yeah, like even the Nintendo one had switched its colors, but it didn't really look like a real gun per se if you like looked at it. Maybe at a glance, but the only other real home console gun that maybe looked real was the Master System one because it was fully black, for example.
Yeah, and now I mean, I will say that I believe it's the Justifier
Mm-hmm.
um, was blue, so it didn't necessarily look. It wasn't the right coloring,
Yeah.
but it was the shape. It was
Yeah.
the shape, and it was the mold. It was very realistic, especially in the arcades.
And there's been these kind of controversies before with like toys as well, where like Megatron looked like a gun, and there were some issues with that. But yeah, the interesting thing about these trials were that Nintendo and Sega had very differing opinions on the matter, and in their opinions on like which eventually led to the creation of the ESRB. And Nintendo's stance was basically that everything they released was kid friendly. It
Yeah.
was very family oriented content, which personally I don't agree with. Mortal Kombat had been released on it, and regardless of the blood being omitted from the game,
It still had the
yeah,
fatalities.
it still had the fatalities, which were gory and one of the main points of the th- of the whole controversy between the violence.
Now, I will say Mortal Kombat is a bit of an outlier for Nintendo.
Hmm.
A lot of their stuff is a lot more safe, and I
It
mean,
is.
they. I will say that specifically back then,
Hmm.
they had fairly strict rules
They did, but
about releasing content, and they policed what was released for their system a lot more than they would now.
in North America.
Yes, in
And
North
what
America.
in this and also so the audience is aware, we're talking about Nintendo of America and Sega of America because
Yes.
Nintendo in Japan, the parent company is they don't really censor anything in Japan. There's some Kid Dracula is a good example. The boss of the first level is not kid friendly. Um, so
Look it up.
yeah.
I was surprised.
Um, so the Yeah, that's what Nintendo's stance was, and one of the reasons why I kind of disagree with this is because just calling the monsters in Contra aliens or robots is not necessarily a way to make it kid friendly.
Yeah.
They look like people and soldiers, and you're running and gunning them down. Like that's what the point of the game is. If you tell me it's a robot and it looks like a human, like okay, sure, but I'm not sure. There's a lot of examples like that where they just kind of relabeled something as like a alien, for example, or humans controlled by aliens, which made it okay. That's kind of like what they were talking about. I feel, and I don't necessarily agree with. But Sega's stance was essentially interesting because they already had a rating system.
Yeah.
They had like early childhood and like a teen and a mature rating, and a couple of others, like I think even education. But they basically have their own internal system, and they agreed that there should be an internal system just like there is on movies.
Yeah.
Because um, I, I mean, some people let their children go watch rated R movies, but like for all intents and purposes, the rating is there for a purpose. Like if you allow your kid to go and watch a rated R movie, that's on, I feel, the parent, not necessarily the movie maker for making a rated R movie. Um, and that's kind of why there's rating systems in place.
And
And
that was sort of what Sega's position was. That,
mhm,
I mean, they didn't think that there needed to be more work into it because they already had something.
yeah,
They were already uh, they were already policing it themselves.
right.
They weren't censoring their content.
Yeah, they weren't policing it. They were more just categorizing themselves to
Yeah,
help parents make decisions
and
on whether or
they
not
were
their
fairly
kids should be
descriptive.
playing Mortal Kombat or not.
They were fairly descriptive as to
Hmm.
what the content entailed.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Because looking at a box, you don't necessarily know, like, oh, is Sonic kid friendly? I don't know, right?
yeah,
Like, if you know nothing about video games as a parent, you may not know. But then looking at Mortal
you
Kombat, you might not know because it's just like a logo, a graphic essentially on the case, and on the back there's two people side by side, right, with the different screenplay graphics and stuff like that. You
yeah,
don't know it's not being played.
and you wouldn't know it's any different from, like, I
Hmm.
don't know, Kung Fu for the NES.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah. And so them already having a system, I felt that they were kind of already on board with this. And yeah, so you can kind of take a gander on exactly what their opinion on this matter was. But I found it interesting because how Nintendo and Sega kind of stances sort of were completely different on them, and how they basically chose their battles with this. And the ultimate release of this was that the new SRB was created, and what's interesting now is it's kind of helped Nintendo, in my opinion, release more than just family fun games.
yeah,
Because
because I mean, what's sort of funny ultimately is that, like, Night Trap
mhm,
was one of the titles that Nintendo was like, this is atrocious.
yeah,
How can Sega put this out on their system? And at this point now, you can go buy Night Trap for your Nintendo Switch.
yeah, exactly.
But again,
And
it's
MK11
it's
and
rated
yeah,
appropriately, right? It's actually, I think Night Trap's even teen rated at this point.
yeah,
I don't think it's a mature rated title anymore.
yeah.
But
But
yeah,
that kind of goes with
that's
like
another story. But
yeah,
yeah, it really has kind of helped define them
hmm,
now that, okay, well, we can put whatever we want on here because it has a rating.
exactly. And the main reason why this, during the early 90s, one of the reasons why this become such a big issue outside of the senator story was because in the United States this was at a time where there was record high gun violence in the country. So there was a little bit of a moral panic behind what was causing this, and a lot of people pointed at video games because inherently some video games are very violent.
Yeah.
If it's anything from like raw carnage to just shooting people. Both are violent. There's different variances of them, is kind of what I'm trying to get at. This kind of led to them kind of wondering what was causing it. And I feel that video games is kind of an unknown kind of um, media at the time, and unfortunately, kind of now too, to some extent for some older generations. But it was kind of unknown, and they didn't necessarily know or care to sort of look at it in the same light that they sort of looked at it in movies. Because a lot of the time, they were like, "Oh, well, kids aren't going to be seeing Terminator 2 or something like that. Like it's a
Whereas
rated
I
R
was a kid
movie."
when I saw Terminator 2.
Yeah, I
And I
saw
feel
Terminator 2
like,
whenever I was like 10.
yeah, like I feel like big action movies are a little bit for kids
Mm-hmm.
to some degree. I mean, it's,
Yeah,
you're not going to take your kid to see Eyes Wide Shut, but
probably not.
you might take your kids to see Terminator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit scary,
Yep.
but
And some
it's
kids can handle it, and some kids can't. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and it.
I know I always had a rule. I wasn't allowed to watch rated R movie unless my mother was in the room. Up until basically I was in middle school, because some of the movies had themes in them or scenes in them that were not age appropriate. Like Conan the Barbarian is a good example of that because there's
I can't think of
a
a single thing in Conan the Barbarian that's not age appropriate.
yeah,
Not a single thing.
not a single thing. But I grew up fine. But anyway, so
But anyway, so at 93 we had a bit of moral panic around gun violence. The people kind of set their sights on lethal enforcers
mhm,
because guns.
yeah.
But really the big one for violence was Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, because this game was cited a lot. And the major connection points with this game and their contention with it was because the characters were digitized, so they looked a lot more realistic than like the graphics of Mario or
Yeah, you
Sonic.
you didn't really have people using like digitized sprites.
Hmm.
Like these were actually actors. I remember buying a Game Pro before this came out, and it had a bunch of like stills
Yeah,
from the making of the game.
yeah,
And I
and
was so impressed. Like young Ian was just like, "Oh man, this is so cool."
yeah, and I remember seeing articles as well in magazines. I forget exactly which ones, but they actually showed like the people, pictures of them like in the studio and stuff like that to show how exactly it was being made
Yeah.
and stuff like that. It was really really cool. So yeah, there was that, and the fatalities were very graphic, especially for the time. There are other fighting games such as like Street Fighter as the prime example, but none of them had a effective finisher essentially that you
Yeah.
could use to basically finish a person, where you basically like rip out their spine or something like
Well,
that, or
you're
freeze them and
given
then like break them into 100 pieces or
you're given
something.
that moment.
Yeah.
When they hit that point, you get the big like finish him in
Yeah.
blood, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
you have your couple seconds to throw in that combo,
Yeah.
rip out their spine.
Yeah. Which is kind of funny too, because it didn't tell you exactly how to do the codes in the instruction manual. You had to learn them through like the like Nintendo Power or Gaming
Probably
Game Pro or
probably
something
Game
like
Pro, yes.
probably Game Pro. But so like the parents would have had to buy them not only the game but the magazine on how to do these too. So
Yeah,
I
it's
digress. Yeah. Um, and I always kind of thought that this was kind of silly because uh, if you watch like the Transformers or the Ninja Turtles or even GI Joe, like there's tons of fighting in these cartoons,
yeah.
and they're age appropriate, and I'm air quoting that in case you're only listening. But the video games essentially for Mortal Kombat was basically the same amount of violence, like minus the fatalities, for example.
But that kind of brings us to our third point about, or the third issue that people had with this,
Hmm.
and that's blood.
Yeah,
Because as much as there was fighting and shooting in like He-Man and GI Joe,
yeah,
you didn't have blood.
yeah. It was a lot of like,
Maybe a bit of oil and like transmission fluid in Transformers,
yeah,
but
but yeah, those are their main contention points. I don't know. Looking back on it, it's I don't really remember what I thought of it at the time. I was fairly young and probably wasn't watching the news or caring. I was just playing the games. Uh, and I don't know. Looking back on it, I find it's kind of silly because I remember reading up about it a little bit too in high school, and then reading a lot of articles that cited into research because this essentially sparked research into was this causing issues with children and violence, and there was no indicators as to whether or not this actually did, and it was found that it wasn't. Like you basically get the same like pleasure receptors of essentially killing somebody in a video game and like eating ice cream. So I guess like if you have a problem with this, stop feeding your kids sugar. Like,
It's
I don't know. It was just, yeah, I've always found it kind of interesting because, like, even like Dr. Phil has been cited as showing. I'll show the clip here.
I do remember when Mortal Kombat came out. I do remember being excited to play it.
Hmm.
And I never remember, like, I don't remember the controversy around it at the time, but also,
Yeah.
I was a little kid and I wasn't paying attention to the news. And I mean, if you haven't been paying attention, we also live in Canada.
Yeah.
So I mean, gun violence wasn't at an all-time high
That's
at that
true.
point for us. So I don't think it kind of hit as hard up here. Now,
Hmm.
I mean, we still ultimately did deal with the ramifications of the ESRB because that's what all of our content is rated on now.
Yeah, you started seeing it all the box art and things like that, and in commercials and everything else. And yeah, it's I don't know. I always found it a good system because like my mom, whenever I first played Grand Theft Auto, was concerned. She's like, "Oh, like what do you do in this game?" And like we showed her, and she's like, "Oh, it's not that bad." Like I had watched Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, like it wasn't any different, really.
No, and I mean inherently the game doesn't tell you go and run over a pile of people.
Hmm.
It essentially it's like playing a mob game.
Hmm.
Like the story was really cool.
Yeah.
I always, even all the way back to the first Grand Theft Auto, I dug the story,
Yeah.
and I loved that they broke it up into, you had two separate stories per section. So you had six different things working for six different people with different personalities.
Yeah.
They did a lot to make that interesting for what it was.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why Grand Theft Auto London is still one of my favorite
Yeah.
Grand Theft Auto games, is because of the comedy and the story behind that game.
Yeah,
Who's remaking that
like
game?
even back, like way back to the beginning, they had great writing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that's never changed. And I mean, I don't want to get way off topic here. We'll kind of loop back to that eventually, but kind of to the original point. Looking back on Mortal Kombat,
Mm-hmm.
I can see why people would be surprised because
Especially
for
if
the
they don't.
time there wasn't anything like it.
Yeah, and
But
especially if they don't know and understand video games and sort of like its medium.
yeah,
It could definitely look scary to somebody who doesn't necessarily know anything about them, because it's like,
absolutely.
oh no, people are dying, like this is bad. It's like, yep, it
Like,
is.
yeah, I mean, if you're just if you're only taking in like very light forms of entertainment,
Hmm.
um, but like I'm pretty sure I'd seen Bloodsport. Probably shouldn't have, but I saw Bloodsport, and yeah, like what playing Mortal Kombat, it was just like a it was that,
Hmm.
it was a fighting game
Yep.
that had, it was realistic, in that the sprites looked real,
Hmm.
and and you had blood and the fatalities were super cool, and
Yeah, they were
um,
so over the top though. Like
yeah, like
even
you're,
as
no
like a
matter
10 year
how
old,
strong you are, you're not going to be able to rip someone's spine out.
yeah,
That's just not.
it's like I'm pretty sure most people
Except
and
maybe Conan the
children.
Barbarian.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure like most people and children sort of like like or teenagers I guess understand that like you can't grab somebody by the throat and lift them 2 feet off the ground. Like physics and weight distribution doesn't work that
Yeah,
way.
like I do not have a harpoon I can like juck out of my arm,
Yeah.
nor can I freeze somebody. Like there's so many things about this that were ridiculous and do line up
Mhm.
with what a ridiculous fighting game should be.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know, for anyone to be like, "Oh no, the children." Uh I don't know.
Yeah. And other countries have their own rating systems. The ESRB really only covers Canada, United States, and Mexico. And one of those other systems are the PEGI system, which stands for the Pan European Gaming Information. It was kind of created, kind of sort of like as a European Union kind of got formed and everything, so that they could use all one system. It was formed in 2003. Is all the EU minus Germany and Israel uses it. Germany has its own rating system. I will not attempt to say it, but it's
USK.
yeah, USK. This is what the actual word is. It was founded in 1994, so around the same time. It has a unique rating system board, essentially because, to sum it up, it essentially bans hate groups and iconography related to them, or relatable iconography to specific hate groups. They have a list of certain ones that are not acceptable. And games either need to be completely changed to not have them, or like this is an issue with a lot of World War II games, for example,
Yep.
because they're not allowed to have certain iconography from the bad guys of that war.
Now they do have like it is very similar to the other ones. That this clause like in particular is something specific to them.
Mm-hmm.
There is a clause that covers art,
Right.
and depending on the content, sometimes it can be considered as art.
Right.
Unfortunately, not everything makes that classification, and it does have to be adjusted
Yeah.
or changed. And I mean, it has led to some things just optioning not to release in Germany.
Yeah.
Gears of War didn't release in Germany.
Yeah. They just chose not to because the iconography was too similar.
Yeah, so they German stores just imported it from other countries within the EU.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then eventually they had to, or I think by the time the third one came out, they actually got it
Okay.
rated in Germany. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they just didn't want to go through the hassle of it.
Yeah. Another rating system is for Australia. Theirs is called the Australian Classification Board. This one seems to be the most conservative, in my opinion. A lot of their rating system not necessarily has to do with the violence, but with its sexual content. The content in their classifications on why a game is a certain rating isn't necessarily due to certain violence. Because, like, uh, too much violence in ESRB will basically make the game at least rated T. And then if you add in a couple of extra themes, the game will be rated M. But just because there's sexual content or suggestive themes in a game does not make a game rated M in North America. But it seems like in Australia, it's a lot easier once you get into that territory to make the game essentially a more of a mature rating.
Yeah, to your point on the Australian Certification Board being more conservative, as we were kind of doing research for this, that was one of the things that jumped up. A bunch of the Grand Theft Auto games had actually been either pulled from sale
Yeah.
or banned
Mm-hmm.
due to sexual content within the game.
Yeah.
To the point where future copies actually had to have the ability to interact with sex workers removed.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were like reinstated for sale.
Yeah, which is very weird because, like, one, the game is rated like fairly high to begin with anyway.
Yeah.
And or at least in our rating system. And two, like, why I don't understand why you'd be that conservative on the issue, but to each their own, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of it was something interesting that we noticed as we were going through. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was obviously something that jumped out.
Yeah. Yeah, and all these different rating systems, there's many more, but some of them have actually caused games to basically be outright banned from sale. And one of those examples is in China, a game that I used to play a lot, Command and Conquer Generals, was actually banned from China due to, quote, smearing the image of China and the Chinese army, end quote. And I found that really interesting because, like, they portray like the Americans and the Chinese and the GLA factions very they portray them in certain lights where, like, America doesn't really act that way, so to speak. It's a
Yeah.
stereotype, and like the GLA doesn't necessarily act that way. It's a stereotype. That's what Command and Conquer is. It's a bunch of stereotypes.
Well, the
like,
GLA is not a real thing, is it?
no, but it's kind of like but it's still, it's just like, bad guys from the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh no. But I'm being sarcastic in case nobody's understanding that. But yeah, so it's just a game that was completely outright banned in China, which just seems kind of silly because like I don't even think Red Alert was banned in Russia because like it's like Russia versus the
I mean, but how could you possibly ban that? You had Tim Curry as your leader, and
yeah,
you had that fantastic sniper unit.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, and
But yeah, and also back to Australia, they had pulled. I mean, the Grand Theft Auto games that we talked about, but also one that I found super weird was 50 Cent Bulletproof. Not to kind of harp on the Australian Certification Board.
yeah, we feel bad for you guys.
I
Sorry.
I know, but I mean, another one we found was, and I found this one really interesting, was 50 Cent Bulletproof.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for one, it was 50 Cent's. Oh, it was his first game. He did have two. The second one was really good. But they banned it because they said it promoted gang violence.
Yeah, I guess it's a video game and you part of a gang in it and they're violent.
I
So
mean,
promotion.
I guess so. I mean, maybe D12's considered a gang. I guess.
Maybe, I don't know.
I don't know. Anyways, um, they had to reduce the amount of gore,
Yeah.
uh, cut out an arcade mode,
Mm-hmm.
and then had to put in a feature that if you killed an innocent civilian,
Mm-hmm.
there'd be an auto game over.
Yeah. Which is definitely really weird because like other games handle it a lot better because Hitman, anytime you kill anybody who's innocent, if I recall correctly, it demotes you doing that because you don't get as good of a score essentially.
But what's even more interesting is that they did those things, and then they got an MA15 rating,
Yeah.
which isn't their highest rating. They have an
No.
MA18.
Yeah.
So what they took out these things and they're like, okay, yeah, like you can be 15 and play this now. Like that's super weird because I'm pretty sure over here it's a mature rated game.
Yeah, I think it is.
I
But again, we have all those features, so obviously that makes sense.
yeah, well, I guess so.
Yeah. But history tends to repeat itself, and that's why we're here today, because America. The Americans recently had two recent shootings in Dayton and El Paso, and it basically has created a mass hysteria again. Many Congress spokespeople, news outlets, and the president himself, the president of the United States himself, has basically cited video games as one of the issues with today's youth. I'm not sure I agree with him, but they're an issue. They need to be solved. I don't know. Yeah.
Like I mean, we don't want to say that it's not a horrible thing. Like what happened is horrible.
Mm-hmm.
It's atrocious that that people thought that they could do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real it's a real tragedy. But it's a shame that I feel like we keep coming back to the same point.
Yeah, it's just a big cycle because we've had many instances where video games have kind of been looked at as a potential problem to these social issues that that country specifically is having. Because if you look at the stats, like I think it was a Vox article, I'll show the graph here. Um, uh, Games with violence are sold in more numbers in other countries and have tremendously less amounts of violence in their countries. Like
Yeah.
it's not necessarily because of the video games. And there's been a lot of research to back this up that there isn't necessarily any direct correlation, or there's as much of a correlation between people becoming mass murderers if they just like I don't know, eat carbs. Like there's no correlation to it. It's like this because of that. That's not how things work, right? Like it's just as a gamer it's sort of frustrating.
It is because you have a lot of people, especially kind of like 40 plus,
Mhm.
who now like devalue to me what to me is art.
Mhm.
We have talked at great lengths on this show
Yep.
about so many positive pieces of art, and masterfully told stories,
Hmm.
and then
Beautiful music. We're gonna
and
get to characters design one of
and then
these days. Like,
something like this happens, and it's a huge tragedy, and it's awful, but somehow you get back to um, video games. It's like a knee jerk reaction.
yeah, it seems like to me video games is kind of like a black box that these people don't necessarily know anything about. And instead of actually looking into it or listening to like the hard science behind um the correlation between the two things that they're talking about, video games and violence, they're just like, no, it must be that because it can't be these other things. It can't be parenting. It can't be the movies. It can't be the music that people are listening to. It can't be the way that the person was brought up. It's got to be this, right? It's very ad hoc solutions to it. Like Trump issued immediate action to basically take down any billboards and advertisings from video games and movies that are violent, that incite violence. And Walmart, as a knee jerk reaction, essentially took them down. And they're still selling guns.
Yeah.
Like, you'd think that the access to guns might be part of the problem, but I'm not an expert, so don't necessarily take my word for it. It's just an opinion from one, guy sitting in his game room. But yeah, they took down essentially all these video game displays off their shelves, and
They still sold the video games,
yeah, they still sell them.
but they
And they're
just
probably still selling them to minors too,
yeah,
which
probably.
frustrates me because, like, I mentioned a few times on the show, I worked at EB Games for the like better part of a year and a half, I think, if I recall correctly, during some one of my years in college. And you worked in retail for a few years as well,
Yeah.
like at a music store, and it sold games.
And I worked at HMV,
Right.
and I worked at Toys R Us for a while too.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, whenever I would work at EB, um, a lot of the time the parents would buy their games for kids and they wouldn't look or be concerned about what they were buying. And I would have to mention, because my manager, like, it was a policy, if it's rated M, you had to have a parent with them to purchase the game. So it have all these kids coming in buying Grand Theft Auto underneath the guise of their parents, and I'm like, are you okay with your kid buying that? Yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm like, it's rated M. How old is your kid? 8? It's like, no, he's 7. I'm like, okay, well, like, I might being a little bit hyperbolic here, but like, it's not that far from the truth of like this type of stuff that I would have
No,
to
I mean
deal with.
I legitimately had a parent, like a family, come in after church on a Sunday because everybody was dressed up nice, and the parents told the kid to go pick out a DS game.
Right.
He grabbed Chinatown Wars, which I loved Chinatown Wars, by the way. That's one of the best Grand Theft Autos that is totally underappreciated. But yeah, he picks it up, and parents bring it up, or he brought it up and handed it to me, and I looked at it, and I looked up at his parents, and I'm like, I have to sell this to you. And they're like, well, why? I said, well, this is a mature rated title. You can take a look at it, and it's just, he's seen worse. And I'm
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
okay.
That can't
I
be
mean, do
good.
you wanna? And they're like, just grab it. And I'm like, okay, all right. I mean, it's, um, and then I have friends who are gamers,
Hmm.
who have kids, and they will flat out tell their kids that this content isn't appropriate for you.
Yeah, and I feel like this issue will get a lot better, thankfully, over time because, like, as the initial generation of like gamers has kids and they understand more, and their kids have kids, so on and so forth, they have a better understanding and appreciation for the games, or at least willingness to look into what is it that my kid is playing.
Yeah.
And yeah, and like understand like maybe getting Grand Theft Auto for my kid or Mortal Kombat 11 for my 10-year-old kid isn't the greatest idea ever, right? Like,
But then again, I mean, maybe it is. Maybe he's very mature and
yeah.
understands the content that's there. I mean, Mortal Kombat, it's
Yeah. I played it whenever I was 10.
same,
Like,
right? I mean,
I played Grand Theft Auto whenever I think I was 12 the first time I played it. Like, it
but I
was
mean,
very early.
maybe like throwing something at your kid like BioShock that does have complex moral decisions to make.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
like I probably wouldn't let my kid play Mass Effect, for example, if they were 8.
yeah,
Right? I would tell them no. I love the game. I want you to play it. Future children potentially if you watch this, but not until you're at least 13. Like,
well, I think that's what it comes down to a lot of times is as much as it's good to have something like the ESRB
hmm,
who will categorize content for us
yeah,
and make it a little bit easier. Um,
it's a
it
guide.
it is a guide, and knowing yourself what content is appropriate for you,
Hmm.
and for people that you're buying that content for, I think that's more important.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, because like bringing in government and policy, I don't feel is the solution to this problem. Because if you do, like, it's going to overstep its bounds. Because like this might seem very totalitarian and extreme, but like what I see as the potential solution as to what some people are asking for is basically a gaming card, and it has all your identification information on it, and you have to insert it into the console or PC whenever you're playing a game, and it's like, nope, you are not 18. You are not allowed to play this game, even with parent consent. Goodbye. And you must come back in like a few years whenever you are of age. And it, just kind of like how we look at alcohol and some substances and stuff like that, where it's like it's a cutoff date. You can drive at a certain age and so on and so forth. If we were to do something outlandish like that, uh, it would be counterproductive. It would be a regression of the way that people are exposed to content. And if you're going to do that here, then why stop there? Why, like, there's bad lyrics and certain music, whether it be like traditional rock and roll or hip hop and rap and country music and stuff like that that are very provocative and not necessarily family friendly and things like that. Like,
well,
you're not policing that.
I think one of the biggest issues here is that the medium's so young. Um,
Yes and no. And
it's
I think it's easy to target as well because it makes so much money.
it does.
Yeah. And so because it makes so much money, it's a large piece of the pie of what people are doing.
So the thing about the medium being so young
Hmm.
is that over the last 30 years, you've really seen an evolution of the content, and at this point, um, the stories that we're telling, the complex decisions, the complex moral decisions
Yeah.
you're forcing players to make,
Hmm.
really, it rivals like cinema and television.
Yeah, especially since it is more interactive and it's kind of two-way interaction. You're inputting and getting an output with the game versus a book or a movie that you're actually just you're getting an output.
Yeah, you're just processing the
Hmm.
decisions that somebody else makes.
Yeah.
This is giving you the opportunity to make that decision yourself and to make that story your own.
Hmm. And to your point, like the number of very complex games in that time frame, in the last like 30 years has basically become more and more numerous because you didn't have that many of them early on as you
No.
do now. Because now, almost every adventure game that has a story behind it or role playing game does have some sort of like moral dilemma. That's what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of my favorite aspects of all the different character types in many of the BioWare games is because of those moral quandaries. And yeah,
And
it's
I feel like taking violent like removing violence entirely, you're losing a big aspect of it. I mean, a lot of people will talk about some of the biggest controversial things, and yeah, like going back, and again doing research for this,
mhm,
I played through. Well, I captured the footage from the No Russian mission from Modern Warfare 2.
Yeah, and that scene is really, really crazy because out of context, that scene is terrible.
Yeah, it's
It's very hard. Like it's you don't have to shoot all the civilians, though the AI does shoot some of the civilians on your way through
yeah,
the airport.
the AI will just gun down everybody. It's
Hmm.
your decision if you want to pull the trigger or not.
Yeah,
Um,
but in context, like what is the reasoning behind this? Like you're an undercover agent or something,
yeah,
right?
like the essentially the it sets up the game.
Right,
Like
because it's
it
fairly early on.
yeah, it more or less like it's mission 3, no spoilers here. It basically triggers a war with Russia.
Right.
And like that makes the game. Like that's the whole story behind it is that America like Russia invades America. And you get
Hmm.
some amazing set piece moments like I think it was like Whiskey Hotel where you take back the White House like I'm not American and I was patriotic. Like it's you get great cinematic moments out of that.
Yeah.
But you
You have to set that up for a
yeah,
reason to want or need to do that, right? Um,
you're telling a story. No one's actually getting hurt.
mhm.
That's the most important thing to remember.
Yeah. And
Is
what's the game rated?
it's a mature rated
It's a
title.
mature rated title. So in a movie that would have a very similar plot, like maybe the violence would be a little bit different, but like war is not nice. Like Stallone has said this whenever he was asked about the violence in Cobra in '83, and he was asking about it whenever the new Rambo movie came out, and he wanted to depict as realistic violence as possible because war is not nice. And I agree with them. It's not. And if you're telling the right story and you're in the right circumstance and you have the right label, mature rating, everybody, um, yeah,
Teen.
whatever. And like, okay, if I would say this, if for some reason Doom was rated E for everybody, maybe then we would have a problem. I would be advocating that game needs to have a higher rating. Like, yes, I agree. But it's
No,
very violent.
I
Who
mean I
cares?
will say to a degree again, looking back over this, we obviously have been desensitized a little bit over time
Yeah,
to violence because, you know, things that would have been
it's just
maybe immature.
societal, right? It's
It
not
is.
necessarily the video games; it's society. Because as you were saying with Night Trap, the game was highly rated originally because it was sexually explicit content. But
Yep.
what was sexually explicit in 1950 or 1980 or 93 in this case or four? Isn't the same difference with sexually explicit content that's acceptable now,
Yeah. No,
right? It's changed. People have evolved with their acceptance of what is explicit and what's not. And even to the point where like we're teaching children at a younger age as to like what different sexual orientations and stuff like that is. Not to get too much into that topic, but it like teaching somebody at a younger age now is becoming more acceptable. Whereas if you grew up in 1970, you probably were not taught.
you were probably not taught anything.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Wrap it up, Jimmy. Um,
But yeah, but
yeah, no,
I think you
it is
get the point I'm trying to
yeah, it's
articulate.
that it's a society thing as opposed to the medium itself.
Exactly.
But again, I mean, we've gone on pretty long here. We've taken some tangents,
Yeah.
but I mean, ultimately, I really think um, removing violence from video games is going to limit your ability to tell the stories that you want to tell.
Yeah.
You can tell just as complex of a story in video games as you can in any other form of media.
Yeah.
And you know, if you think, you know, Call of Duty is an issue, well then by that token, Saving Private Ryan is an issue.
Yep.
Because both of them have told the same story in
Yep.
slightly different formats. But you're still passing that information on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is semi-historical,
Yep.
but it doesn't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can still tell complex stories like Mass Effect or
Yeah,
Dragon
and
Age.
I find a lot of the time in those, regardless of if you choose like a good path or a bad path, it's still teaching you something within that moral quandary of like this is the ramifications of doing that,
Yeah.
right? And it's still like it's teaching you something, and that's the whole point that I have, is that like without actually looking into these types of things and in context with these types of things, like you really need to, because like I wouldn't want to speak to violence in movies without looking into violence in movies, or like lyrics being too explicit in like hip hop, because I don't know too much about hip hop, because like I would have to listen to some songs to be like, okay, no, I don't have a problem with it, or I do have a problem with it, right?
Yeah.
Like just
And
as some examples.
and I mean, really, like it again, it's no different from movies. I
Hmm.
mean, sometimes, yeah, I might want to watch something that makes me think a little bit. That happens to be kind of violent, but yeah, maybe I think a little bit. And in comparison, yeah, maybe that's something like playing BioShock.
Yep.
Where yeah, it's kind of violent, but yeah, I also think a little bit. But then sometimes you just want a straight up action movie. You don't want
Hmm.
to have to think too much. And sometimes I just want to play Doom. I don't want to think a whole lot. I just want to run around and
Shoot demons.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The easiest enemy ever.
So that's some of our thoughts on the topic on violence in video games. Yeah, the everything from the ESRB and the rating systems all the way down to, selling stuff in retail stores.
But what do you guys think about the topic? Let us know down in the comments. And we will see you next Wednesday.
See you next week.